So, floor is open.
I'm hungry too.
We've got a bit of time.
Well, maybe just to kick off, question for Greg, I guess. I empathise with an awful lot about what you say. At the same time, sort of linking to Lutzi's last slide, which was a comment by a scientist about social science research. In a sense, you know, dismissing also their research is unscientific, because we're working with basically, or we're seeing results based on one sample. Scientists would, replication is an important part of science.
It's always damning to tell somebody they're not a scientist, but I've conceded that years ago. But scientists won't, I mean, there's some room for replication, but when we have a study, you know, something like post-earnings announcement drift that has been beaten to death, we know that it exists, we've looked at different attributes, there has to be another reason to look at it than just to tell me it also happens in Korea. And what I would say is if an author wants to write a paper like that, they should think carefully about why Korea is different and help me, as another scientist, understand what it is that I'm getting out of Korea that does add that incremental piece.
I agree. In fact, what I was going to lead on to say is I don't think that there can be sort of exact replications, because as the rest of the presentations have been saying, there's so many differences in institutions and, you know, the legal, economic environments that, in a sense, you know, exact replications are impossible, and we should be pushing authors to kind of exploit these differences to develop the insights into a phenomenon that we might be interested in.
Which I think you can oftentimes give back to the authors, and goes back to one of Greg's points, that you really have to think carefully of what answer you can give by studying a particular setting. If it's just a replication, so we take the US research method and apply it to Korea without further thought, then I think that's a typical also here study. But if the authors really try to tease out some of the differences that you were pointing to, then the line is fine between the third bullet point that Greg was mentioning on his slide, so that we can actually learn something by replicating or asking a similar question but in a different institutional setting.
Okay. I have a question or a comment on what Craig said earlier about the governance literature, and he mentioned that we don't know enough about governance because we don't have enough time series studies. And he also pointed out that they have data from 2001 to 2007 or earlier than that, right? That's the story. And I thought one thing they could do, and it'll be very good for everybody, to have changes in governance and see what effects those have on the valuation rather than the level, because the level studies on Tobin's Q has been beaten to death, and we have a lot of studies on that. And I wanted to just point it out from self-serving point of view, and also Greg Miller's point on this thing, how much difficulty we had in this paper, which actually A.B. Smith had a seminal paper on dual class, changes in dual class, which is a type of a corporate governance, and we looked at changes in corporate governance in the dual class literature and what happens to the stock prices subsequently. So every time I sent this paper to JF, JFE, RFS, it ended up with the mafia who believe that the dual class is a bad thing, and we show that dual class changes into dual class was actually a very good thing. So changes in governance, since then, I sort of gave up. I said, I'm not going to do any governance study after this experience. But I think this idea about changes in governance will actually be very helpful. Every time I see these Q studies on governance, I find that people don't go to the change side, which is a very different way to look at things. So maybe you have some comments on that.
At least with respect to the studies I was discussing, in particular those that use governance indices, one of the big problems is the governance changes very slowly over time for most firms. And so when you go to changes, then you don't have any way to identify the effect in your regressions. Having said that, it's a paper I didn't talk about. Bernie Black has a paper where he's looking at governance indices in Russia. And it's a single country study using a number of different governance indices. And he actually has a panel data set up, and he says, here's a country where governance is changing rapidly from year to year. We actually can identify something. And so he can make sort of stronger causal statements. Because I did focus a lot on the governance indices, I didn't talk about, experiments that people have tried to come up with where they use changes in governance to look at changes in values. But there are some of these out there. It just wasn't what I chose to focus on today.
I just want to make two comments. The first one is, I never understood the need in accounting research to categorize areas. In the late 80s, early 90s, there were a lot of questions in seminars, is this accounting research? Then there were questions, is this financial accounting research? And then there are questions, is this international accounting research? I really don't see the need to classify research as either accounting or financial or international accounting research. I think I benefited from Greg's points about this happens here kind of research. And it goes back to the question of whether a paper makes a contribution or not. To study post-announcement drift in another countries, it's probably not making much of a contribution to knowledge. Therefore, it is not a study that will be published in top journals. And I'm sure many of those people who do replication studies actually know that. And submitting such studies to top journals is basically a waste of money. So it all goes down to whether a study is making contribution or not. And categorizing studies as financial or international, I don't think makes much of a, is not useful to me at least.
I mean, maybe other people are a carefuler natural thinker than I am, but my goal in putting that forward was that we start to think more carefully about what we're trying to say in each study. And you're right, if we're already doing that, then that should naturally emerge. But I think sometimes the international barrier, I mean, I've talked to many very good researchers who say things like, why would you define research based on a geographic line? So I would say it's both to be helpful to us as researchers, but also we have to sell our work. And it's to help other people reduce the barriers to understanding what we think the contribution of a given piece of work is. But I'm sympathetic to that, and believe me, while I made the points strongly up here, I went back and forth on pretty much every point on these slides. Is it too draconian to say? And in the end, I decided to play the strong card and see whether I could irritate people.
Pressure builds right before lunch.
They said the food's not ready yet.
I'll make this long-winded then. I want to maybe ask, this is a little bit of a follow-up to Greg's comment, but more broadly from all four of you, actually. I think you may have insights into this. So I've been seeing a lot of studies that are arising in a different setting of the BRIC countries, right? Particularly within China, and sometimes within the other countries as well, Brazil and India and Russia. And I just wanted to get your insights on whether you think that there's a good underlying motivation, back to Peter's, I guess, initial comment about, are studies that seem to be centered within these countries, is there a really good underlying motivation for heading in that direction, or is this going to be kind of the flavor of the decade kind of idea, and then 10 or 15 years from now, when the next series of countries starts evolving, we'll shift to that focus as well? Did you have any thoughts on that, whether or not this new setting now makes sense?
I mean, I think you see more of the flavor of the month type research in general for looking at sort of those countries than you do sort of the carefully thought out, what's unique that, basically Peter was talking about, more driven by sort of popular press in a lot of ways. But I think there are also a lot of studies, interesting studies in those countries that sort of exploit something very unique. But I think in general, it's, my view is, from my reading of it, it's kind of a mixed bag.
But I also think and agree with Greg's earlier comment that these are probably the economies where there is much of change going on, which lets you ask some questions that you usually cannot simply ask, or you don't have the empirical material to come up with some reasonable answers. But on the flip side of that, the question also becomes, well, can we really generalize what we find there? Or how does it translate to other situations where the evolution is now more stable, and what we can really learn to those different settings?
And if you look at all the studies that were done in Japan, right? All the Japanese studies when the Japanese stock market was larger than the U.S. stock market, everybody wanted to know about, Japanese managers and Japanese stock markets, and there's far less interest now in the Japanese market, I would think.
This is a question generally for the panel. There are two ways that are hypothesized. The talk started with the link between corporate governance and firm value, and so obviously the two channels, there's cash flow effects, and generally we think of those as divergent cash flows, and then there's the cost of capital effect that we think of as coming through information asymmetry and so on. And there's a lot of literature on that, and so when you look at, for example, this was Craig's talk, and then Lucy talked about looking at cost of capital, and then when you use measures of the cost of capital, so implied cost of capital, and a lot of very interesting findings. And I think I'm trying to reconcile the findings in this literature with the other literature that looks at, for example, is information asymmetry and information risk systematically priced? And in that, for example, you've got some work, Rodrigo has a paper with John and Wayne, and there's the paper by Shivaraj Gopal and Partha Mohanram is suggesting that, hey, maybe it's not priced. So I'm wondering, when we're looking at two different literatures, is there a need for this literature maybe to reconcile their results with that literature that suggests that maybe it's not priced, or maybe we can recognize that, hey, maybe there isn't consensus in that literature as to whether information risk is not priced. And by the way, when you look at information risk and whether it's priced, there are conflicting results whether you use realized returns versus implied cost of capital, which, for example, Lucy has been using. And the results on implied cost of capital are conflicting. So I guess my question is, is there a burden on this literature to reconcile the results with that literature, or can we recognize that maybe there isn't a consensus in that literature, and maybe it's a division of labor that specialists in each field kind of work out and build a consensus in each area, and then we can try to merge the two?
Can I just get you to clarify? So I'm talking about, is it priced cross-sectionally into firm value? And are you talking about studies that are saying, is this a priced risk factor as if it's in an asset pricing model? Is this what you're talking about?
Yes, so actually, this is a question in general for the panel.
Yeah.
It's more of a commentary that is there, it seems like there are these two literatures that have different findings.
No, they're perfectly consistent, right? If it's priced cross-sectionally and if markets are efficient, you wouldn't expect to see anything in returns, right?
Yes.
And I think that's what you're saying. These
Right.
guys find that it's not priced in returns. Doesn't that make sense?
That's correct. And so when you're looking at the relation between that and firm value, are you saying there's no relation then through the cost of capital effect between firm value and corporate?
No, I'm not saying there doesn't have to be a relation through the cost of capital. Lucy and Christian have a paper where they're disentangling this, so maybe I'll let this piece go to Lucy if he doesn't mind.
Well, I think there are inconsistencies throughout the literature, not particularly in the area that you're mentioning, but I would rather look at it from a different point. Instead of have these two literatures to reconcile. I would rather use it as an opportunity for research. Can we maybe figure out what is going on that produces these different results, which means that can we maybe take the next step and show or identify a research setting that lets us analyze these different forces that seem to be in play and seem to produce somewhat, at least at first view, inconsistent results. And therefore I don't see it on either us, or luckily we have Rodrigo in the room, or let's say them, to reconcile the two streams of research, but I would rather see it as an opportunity.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, and I'm not suggesting that there is a burden on either one to do that. And I think maybe I was suggesting more that there isn't a consensus really in that literature as to whether it is pricing, maybe it isn't. There is more opportunity for research. But I think in terms of learning and what we can, we learn more obviously when we combine two different bodies of knowledge, and I think that's what I was suggesting, that at this point maybe we're still at that stage where we're still learning and trying to reach a consensus in both areas, and then at some point we can.
I just add to that. I think I'm reading to most mining here, but I guess there's one thing that the way I think about this as well is that when you show those results on Q, for example, you have, in my mind, I think I like to see a numerator stored, like the expropriation, which the managers could expropriate the cash flows, but there is another literature that says, well, maybe it's a difference in the denominator as well. It could be a cost of capital effect. And I think the way I see this literature is that how much you think it's important to try to separate. And I think what I'm hearing from Lutz is that, well, maybe it is. Maybe there are some research opportunities in here and try to tease out the research design that say, well, maybe the dominant order here is the numerator effect versus the denominator.
Yeah, he has a paper on that exact issue.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think I mentioned that the effects can run both ways through the numerator and denominator, but I didn't spend a lot of time discussing it, right? It's a hard thing to disentangle, as Lutzi will tell you.
Yeah, but I think that's an illustration of the issue, that we start out with a result, and then afterwards we find maybe some opposing results or some opposing theories that make us reconsider or dig deeper in that particular area in order to further advance.
Look at the clock, we still have time.
I have a question.
All right. Is that okay with you guys? Go for it.
Greg.
Yes.
Do you think that I agree with almost most of your points? One exception is
Better than normal.
the international in the title. Don't you think that many of your comments also apply to our research in general? So isn't there also here research, let's say, in the US? Or shouldn't we ask, what can we learn? Should
I think
any
if you're saying
researcher ask, what can we learn from
I think that's true, but I think on each of your 3 slides, you talked about the extra complexity when you start dealing with international data and when you start dealing with an international setting. And so what I'm saying is I think that extra complexity often gets in the way of people understanding. And so I would suggest that if we can focus on what that extra complexity is adding and how we're using it in this situation, we're going to end up with better research. But I mean, we're all free to disagree on these sort of things. Can we get a show of hands?
some do, some don't?